The door swung open, and the noise hit me like a wave. Laughter, clinking glasses, the thumping bass that rattled the floor. The air was thick with the scent of spilled liquor and bodies pressed too close together. Someone brushed against my shoulder as they stumbled past, nearly knocking me off balance. Jack didn't notice. He was already ahead, weaving through the crowd with ease, throwing a greeting here, a handshake there, already lost in his world. He had begged me to come tonight, yet within seconds, I was alone. I exhaled sharply and stepped forward, heels clicking against the sticky floor. My skirt clung to my thighs as I moved, the cool air conditioning doing nothing to stop the heat crawling up my neck. I should have stayed home. Pushing through the bodies, I made my way toward the bar, dodging a guy sloshing his beer, and a couple tangled in each other like they were the only two people in the room. My heart pounded, not from excitement, but from the energy in the air, the tension that crackled like static electricity. And then I felt it. A pull. A weight. A presence. My breath hitched before I even turned my head.
Will.
Jack's best friend. Leaning against the bar, drink in hand, looking at me like he had every right to. Like he had been waiting. His eyes didn't flick away when I caught him staring. He didn't even pretend to be subtle. It wasn't a glance, it wasn't casual, it was deliberate.
Slow.
Heavy. Like he was taking his time, dragging his gaze down the length of me, lingering where he shouldn't. I should have ignored it, looked away. But I didn't. I held his stare, pulse hammering in my throat. The air around us shifted, the crowd blurring into nothing. Just for a second, it was only him and me. And I knew this was a mistake. The bar was packed. Someone shoved past me, nearly knocking my drink out of my hand. A group of guys burst into laughter near the pool table, voices too loud, drowning out the music. My phone buzzed in my purse, but I ignored it. I wasn't thinking about any of it.
I was thinking about him.
I forced myself to turn away, to act like I hadn't noticed the way Will was looking at me. I took a sip of my drink, pretending to focus on something, anything else. But I could feel it. The heat of his stare. The way it lingered. And then suddenly he was there. Too close. Too fast. I hadn't even heard him move, but now his body was just inches from mine. My stomach clenched, and before I could step back, his voice cut through the noise.
Low. Smooth.
Too personal. The way he said my name made my skin prickle. He wasn't just making conversation. He was testing me, pushing just enough to see how I'd react. I forced a smirk, raised my glass, took a slow sip, acted like I didn't feel the way my pulse was racing. But then his hand, barely there, just his fingertips grazing my wrist.
Light.
Casual, like it could have been an accident. But it wasn't. And we both knew it. I should have pulled away.
I should have said something.
Instead, I stood there, frozen, letting the moment stretch longer than it should have. And in that split second, I realized this wasn't harmless anymore. The air around me felt different. The bar was packed, bodies moving, voices overlapping, but I wasn't really there anymore. My drink felt cold in my hand, but my skin burned. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out the noise. Will had gotten too close. His voice had dipped lower, the kind of tone that made it clear he wasn't just talking for the sake of conversation. It was personal, deliberate. He was testing me, seeing how I'd react. And for a second, just one stupid second, I didn't. I just stood there. I should have moved away immediately. I should have laughed it off, made a joke, done something to shut it down. But my body didn't listen. His fingers had barely touched my wrist, but my breath still hitched, my skin still reacted. It wasn't a hard grip. It wasn't even a real touch. But it was enough. Because I felt it. Something inside me shifted, and I hated it. I forced myself to step back, my stomach twisting, my heartbeat erratic. I wasn't the type to entertain this. This wasn't me.
But Will?
He didn't look away. He didn't even try to pretend this moment wasn't happening. If anything, The challenge in his expression only deepened. His lips curled slightly, his eyes dark, like he knew, like he saw right through me. Then, out of nowhere, Jack. His voice hit me before I even saw him.
Loud. Carefree.
Unaware. Will didn't flinch. He didn't look guilty. He didn't move away suddenly like a man who had just crossed a line. Instead, he leaned back slightly, relaxed, smiling, as if nothing had just happened. It was seamless, like he had done this exact thing before. Jack was grinning, his arm casually looping around my waist, his body warm against mine. A comfort, a safety, something I should have leaned into. But I couldn't, because my head was spinning, because my stomach was still tight, because I felt different now. I took a slow breath, forcing a small smile, praying Jack didn't see it, didn't feel the stiffness in my body, the way my fingers gripped my drink a little too tight. If he noticed anything off, he didn't say it. He just kept talking, already laughing at something Will had said. As if the air between us hadn't just changed forever. Will's eyes met mine again, just for a second. A fraction of a second. But it was enough. There was no regret in his face. No hesitation. And worst of all, I didn't hate it. Something in me twisted, sharp and unfamiliar. A crack in something that shouldn't have cracked. Jack kissed the side of my head absent-mindedly, already looking toward his friends. The moment was over. At least for him. But not for me. For me, it had just begun. I didn't know if I wanted to run from it or lean into it and see how far it could go. The night dragged on, but I wasn't really there. Laughter, music, conversations, everything blurred into the background. Except him. Every time I turned my head, every time I moved through the crowded bar, I felt it. That stare. Heavy, persistent, unshakable. Will wasn't just watching me. He was waiting. And I hated how much I noticed. Jack was talking to someone, probably about work, maybe about sports, I didn't know. I nodded when I needed to, smiled at the right moments, but I wasn't present. I was too aware. Too stuck in the moment that had already happened, too afraid of the one that might come next. And then my phone buzzed. A short vibration. A single notification. I reached into my purse, fingers suddenly clumsy, my pulse spiking before I even saw the message. It was just a few words. Too few. But they burned into my brain instantly. I deleted it immediately. But it was too late. Because I had read it. Because I understood it. And because my body reacted before my brain could shut it down. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my fingers tightening around my phone. The room suddenly felt hotter, like all the air had been sucked out. I forced myself to breathe, forced myself to focus. But it wasn't working. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about Jack. I was thinking about Will. And that thought followed me home. Jack fell asleep almost instantly, his breathing steady, his body relaxed. The weight of the night didn't touch him. But I was wide awake, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart still racing. My mind refusing to shut off. The memory of Will's touch, his voice, the way his eyes held mine, it wouldn't leave me alone. I turned onto my side, squeezing my eyes shut. My breathing was uneven, my body restless. I ran my hand over my stomach, up to my ribs, trying to calm myself, trying to release the tension building inside me. But it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. I bit my lip, frustration knotting in my chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to feel like this. But I did. And now I needed to figure out how to stop it. The house was quiet, except for Jack's steady breathing beside me. He slept deeply, unaware, unbothered, completely detached from the storm raging inside me. I lay there for what felt like hours, my skin too hot, my mind too loud, thoughts spiraling in directions I didn't want them to go. I needed air. Slipping out of bed, I grabbed my phone and made my way downstairs. The moment I stepped outside, the cool night air hit my skin, But it didn't help. My chest was still tight, my pulse still erratic. And then he was there. I hadn't even heard him, but suddenly, Will was standing just a few feet away, leaning against my porch railing like he had been waiting for me. Like he knew I'd come out. The street was empty. The world was asleep. It was just me and him. His eyes dragged over me, slow and heavy, as I folded my arms across my chest, suddenly too aware of my thin camisole, the way my bare legs caught the moonlight. I should have turned around. Should have gone back inside. Should have ended this now. But I didn't. Because a part of me knew he wouldn't let me. You couldn't sleep either, huh? His voice was smooth, confident. Too confident. I swallowed, my throat dry. Just needed some air. Sure, he said, and I hated how much meaning he packed into that one word. He wasn't asking why I was out here. He already knew. My stomach clenched. He was pushing again, but this time, there were no distractions. No Jack. No crowd. No easy way out. He took a step closer and my body tensed, but I didn't move. I should have moved. You keep running, he murmured, tilting his head, eyes locked onto mine. But you don't really want to. A shiver ran down my spine. He was right. And that terrified me. I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms. You're imagining things. Will smirked, like he saw straight through me. Like he could feel the war raging in my head. You keep telling yourself that, he said, his voice lower now. Darker. I took a sharp breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. I needed to get out of here. I needed to end this before it was too late. But something in the way he looked at me, the way his presence pulled me in even when I fought it, it made me wonder. Maybe it already was too late. I should have walked away. Should have turned around, gone back inside, and locked the door behind me. But I didn't. I stood there, my feet rooted to the ground, my breath coming too fast, my body betraying me in ways I didn't want to acknowledge. Will's eyes never left mine, dark and too knowing, like he could see right through the weak excuses I kept telling myself. You're quiet, he said, stepping closer. I tensed. He was just a foot away now, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something deeper beneath it, something undeniably him. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. Go home, Will. He didn't move.
Didn't flinch.
Instead, he smirked. That what you really want? I hated the way my stomach tightened at those words. Hated that he was calling me out so effortlessly. Hated that I wasn't sure how to answer. A car passed down the street, its headlights briefly illuminating us. For a second, I wondered if the driver could see it, this invisible pull between us, the tension thick enough to choke on. Will tilted his head slightly, eyes still locked on mine. You gonna keep pretending? His voice was lower now, quieter. A challenge. A threat. A promise. I sucked in a breath, my nails digging into my palms. My heart slammed against my ribs, the air around us suddenly suffocating. I'm not pretending anything, I managed to say, but my voice betrayed me. It wasn't strong. It wasn't convincing. Will's lips curled, and he took another step. Too close. I felt it then, his heat, the way his presence overwhelmed everything else. My body wanted to move forward. My brain screamed to step back. I was caught in the middle, trapped between the right thing and the thing I couldn't seem to stop craving. His hand lifted, and for a split second, I thought he was going to touch me. But he didn't. He let it hang there, just inches from my skin, like he was daring me to close the distance myself. I couldn't breathe. I didn't realize how long we had been standing like that until another gust of wind hit my skin, cooling the heat burning inside me. That moment, that single moment, was enough to snap me out of it. I took a step back. Then another. My hands clenched at my sides as I forced oxygen into my lungs. Go home, I repeated, and this time, it sounded like I meant it. Will watched me for a second longer, eyes flickering with something unreadable. Then, finally, he stepped back. But before he turned away, before he walked off into the night like nothing had happened, He smirked. And then he said something that sent a shiver down my spine. "You'll come to me first." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because the worst part? The part that scared me more than anything else? I wasn't sure if he was wrong. I stood there, frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears as Will disappeared into the night. The weight of his words pressed down on me, suffocating. "You'll come to me first." The arrogance. The certainty. The way he said it like a fact, not a possibility. I hated that part of me wasn't sure he was wrong. The wind picked up, cutting through the thin fabric of my tank top, but I barely felt it. My skin was still burning from the heat of his presence, the way his voice had wrapped around me like a trap. I needed to go inside. I needed to forget this. But as I walked back toward the house, my legs felt unsteady. My body still hummed with something I didn't want to name. I slipped back into bed carefully, careful not to wake Jack. He shifted slightly, murmured something in his sleep, then settled. The contrast between them was stark. Jack, warm, steady, predictable. Will, sharp edges and reckless energy. A storm I wasn't sure I wanted to escape. I turned onto my side, squeezing my eyes shut, but my brain wouldn't shut off. The way he stood too close. The way he didn't touch me, but it felt like he did. The way I wanted to close the distance myself. I threw the covers off, frustrated. This wasn't me. This wasn't who I was. I was a wife. A good one. A faithful one. But for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. And that was the most dangerous feeling of all. The next morning, I barely slept. By the time Jack's alarm went off, I was already awake, staring at the ceiling, willing myself to pull it together. "Morning, babe," Jack mumbled, pressing a lazy kiss to my shoulder before rolling out of bed. I forced a smile, hoping it reached my eyes. I followed him into the kitchen, forcing normalcy into my movements.
Coffee. Toast.
Light conversation about his plans for the day. But my mind was somewhere else. When my phone buzzed, I nearly dropped the mug in my hand. I knew who it was before I even looked. I shouldn't have looked. But I did. Will. Sleep well? A slow, heavy breath left my lips as I stared at the screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I should delete it, ignore it, block his number. But I didn't. Because the truth was, I hadn't slept at all. And somehow he knew that. My phone vibrated again. I didn't need to check. I knew who it was. I ignored it, but it felt like the message was burning through my palm, demanding to be read. I tightened my grip on the coffee mug in my other hand, forcing myself to breathe normally. Jack was sitting right there at the kitchen table, focused on his laptop, scrolling through emails.
He didn't look at me.
But if he did, he would know. I took a slow sip, pretending everything was fine. But my hands weren't steady. My body wasn't steady. I needed to get out of the house. The air felt too thick, the walls closing in. I grabbed my keys and told Jack I had errands to run. He barely looked up, just nodded, too distracted by whatever was on his screen. The moment I stepped outside, I exhaled sharply, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I was losing control. I got in the car and drove, no destination in mind, just my hands gripping the wheel, my mind racing. The hum of the engine was supposed to calm me, but it didn't. Nothing did. I reached a red light and, against my better judgment, picked up my phone. One new message. Look outside. My stomach dropped. My breath caught as I turned my head, heart pounding, fingers tightening around the steering wheel. 3 lanes over, he was there.
Will.
Sitting in his car. Window down. Watching me. A slow smirk spread across his face, his fingers tapping against the wheel like he had all the time in the world. Like he was waiting for me to react. This wasn't an accident. He followed me. My body locked up. The light turned green, but I didn't move. The car behind me honked, snapping me back to reality. I slammed my foot on the gas, heart racing, tires screeching as I pulled forward. But so did he. He switched lanes effortlessly, keeping up with me, mirroring my every move. What the hell was he doing? Adrenaline surged through me. My fingers were slick against the wheel. This was beyond a game now. This was something else. I swerved into a side street, hoping to lose him, but when I checked the mirror, he was still there, right behind me. Panic clawed up my throat. My mind spun through options, but there were none. I could feel it now. This wasn't just him playing with me. This was control. And I had none. I needed to stop this before it was too late. I needed to stop him. But deep down, I knew I should have stopped this a long time ago. I barely made it home. My hands were shaking as I killed the engine, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I sat in the driveway for a second, gripping the wheel, trying to steady my breath, trying to convince myself that I could still fix this. I couldn't. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. Something was wrong. The air was thick, charged, like the moment before a storm. Jack stood in the middle of the living room, not working, not distracted, waiting. His face was unreadable for a second. Then he turned. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt something cold and sharp sink into my stomach. He knew. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but he moved first. The coffee table shook as he slammed something down on it. My phone. Unlocked. The screen was lit up. Messages open. Will's name right there. Everything inside me froze. My mouth went dry. I couldn't breathe. Jack took a slow step forward. He wasn't yelling. That should have made me feel safer, but it didn't. It made my skin crawl. His jaw was tight, fists clenched at his sides like he was holding something back. "I want to hear you say it," he finally said, voice low, shaking. "Tell me the truth." I hesitated for 1 second too long. His eyes flashed, and then he snapped. He grabbed my phone, threw it across the room. It hit the wall hard, shattering. I flinched. I had never flinched around Jack before. That was the moment I realized I was afraid of him. Jack had never been violent, never even raised a hand to me. But the way he looked at me now, like I was someone he didn't recognize, like I was a stranger standing in his house, it terrified me. "You lied to me," he said, voice trembling with rage.
For how long?
I shook my head. My lips parted, but I had no words. How was I supposed to explain something I didn't even understand myself? Jack let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. He was unraveling right in front of me. "I should have seen it," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "I should have known." I took a step forward, but he backed away, like he couldn't stand to be near me. The look in his eyes sent ice through my veins. This wasn't my husband anymore. This was a man who had been pushed too far, whose entire world had just collapsed. And I was the one who had done it. I was on my knees. I had never begged for anything in my life, but I was begging now. Jack stood over me, arms crossed, face like stone.
No emotion. No anger.
Nothing. Just a hollow emptiness that was somehow worse than if he had screamed at me. "Please," my voice cracked. My hands clutched at his shirt, desperate, shaking. "Jack, I'm sorry. I swear it didn't mean." His hand shot up. Not to hit me. He had never touched me in anger before, but to shut me up. "Don't," he said coldly. I froze. I had lost him. I could feel it. Everything we had built, our life, our marriage, our family, it was crumbling right in front of me, and I had no one to blame but myself. I thought he would leave, thought he would pack a bag and walk out the door. But he didn't. Instead, he exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw like he was thinking, calculating. Then finally he spoke. "You want to fix this?" His voice was too calm. I nodded frantically, gripping onto whatever shred of hope I had left. He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "All right." For a split second I thought he meant it. But then his lips curled into something that wasn't a smile. It was darker, colder. There's only one way. I felt my stomach drop. Something about his tone made my skin prickle, made me regret begging. I swallowed hard. Anything. Jack tilted his head, studying me like I was something else now. Not his wife. Not the woman he had loved for years. Just a person who had broken something irreplaceable and now had to pay the price. His next words shattered whatever hope I had left. I barely heard them, barely understood at first. But when I did, my blood ran cold. I should have seen it coming. The way Jack looked at me, empty, detached, cruel. He wasn't my husband anymore. He was a man pushed too far, a man who had shattered into something unrecognizable. And now, he was going to make me feel every single piece of it. I agreed to his terms without thinking. Desperate, terrified, willing to do anything. But I hadn't expected this. I thought he wanted revenge. To hurt me like I had hurt him. Maybe scream, maybe walk away forever. But he didn't. He stayed. And then he used me. Not like a husband. Not like someone who once loved me. Like something disposable. Like I was nothing. Like I was him in this story. The one left behind. The one made to feel powerless. I couldn't cry.
I wouldn't give him that.
But my body betrayed me in other ways. Trembling hands, a stomach twisted in knots, a deep, sinking dread in my chest. Because this wasn't over. When it was done, when I thought I had given him enough, when I thought I had paid my price, he laughed. Not a real laugh. Something bitter.
Hollow. Wrong.
You think this is enough? His voice was sharp as glass, cutting through the last piece of my sanity. I barely managed to whisper, "What more do you want?" Jack leaned in, his breath against my ear, and said something so insane, so twisted, so unbelievable. I jerked back, my breath catching in my throat.
No. Igaspat.
You can't be serious. But his eyes told me he was. And worse, I knew I was going to do it.